awtur magħruf Iżlandiż li rebaħ il-Premju Letterarju tal-Kunsill Nordiku, premju ekwivalenti għal Man Booker Prize, bir-romanz tiegħu The Blue Fox. Ir-romanz From the Mouth of the Whale kien fost il-finalisti għal Premju Internazzjonali Impact ta' Dublin tal-Letteratura u għal Premju Indipendenti tal-Finzjoni Barranija. Ir-romanz Moonstone, The Boy Who Never Was, għal Premju Letterarju Iżlandiż. Ix-xogħol l-iktar reċenti tiegħu, Codex 1962, romanz fi 3 kotba ġie pubblikat fl-Iżlanda fl-2016 u ntlaqa tajjeb ħafna. Dan ix-xogħol se jinqaleb f'diversi lingwi fl-2018 u fl-2019. Bħala poeta, librettist u liriċista ippubblika 9 ġabrijiet ta' poeżiji, kiteb 4 libretti tal-opra u l-lirika ta' bosta artisti. Fl-2001 innominaw għall-Oscar bil-lirika fil-film Dancer in the Dark. Ir-romanzi tiegħu ġew pubblikati f'35 lingwa. Sjón huwa l-President tal-PEN fl-Iżlanda u jgħix f'Reykjavik flimkien ma' martu u ż-żewġ uliedu. I now welcome Sjón on stage and Albert Gatt, who will be interviewing him.
So, hi. Have you been having a good festival?
Very much so, and I'm very glad to have been invited to this wonderful festival and to this amazing country and magical city. So you're looking at a happy Icelander here.
Oh, good. What I really like about this festival is that it's a bit of a Babel. Even tonight, you know, the first night you read in Icelandic in translation already. We heard Frisian, we heard Calabrian, Tuscan, Castellano, Maltese, English, and so on. And I always feel I understand nothing and I understand everything at the same time. I don't know if you get the same feeling. And I was thinking about this and trying to connect it to something I heard you say yesterday during the workshop, actually. Because you write in Icelandic, and Icelandic, like Maltese, is a language that linguists like to call a small language. And the observation you made yesterday is, well, concerned, this idea of whether languages can be thought of as small or large. And can you comment a bit on that?
Yes, when you're from a country that doesn't have a big population, like we do, there is 330,000 of us in Iceland, with Icelanders living abroad and foreigners who have studied the language and speak it. Maybe there are 350,000, 360,000 speakers of the Icelandic language in the world. And some years ago, our former president, Vigdís Finnbogadóttir, who is a great champion of languages and literature, she quite strictly forbid that we would ever speak of the Icelandic language as a small language. And instead she proposed the term languages spoken by few and languages spoken by many. And Icelandic is obviously a language spoken by few. But the point she was making is that a language cannot be seen as a big or a small language. When you look at which possibilities the languages have. And she took as an example Dante and the Divine Comedy, and she said, if it is possible to translate the Divine Comedy into Icelandic, then the Icelandic language is big enough for Dante. And we have the Divine Comedy in Icelandic, we have the Bible, we have the complete works of Shakespeare, we have Gabriel García Márquez, we have the poetry of T.S. Eliot. So obviously this language is big enough for those giants, even though it's spoken by few. And I think it is a thought that helps us respect languages and respect that every language should have its should be given its given the possibility of showing its size,
Yeah.
flexibility.
It's interesting that the idea of the size of a language, whatever that means, is often connected to the size of a literature. In literary criticism, sometimes one hears talk of minor literatures and major literatures. And I don't know, do these terms mean anything to you? What makes a major literature? And where would you, how do you see Icelandic literature in this context, if it's meaningful at all?
Well, we don't use those terms in Iceland.
Good for you.
Because we are obviously a part of the major literatures, so we don't even have to think about it, you know. An Icelandic author is in a very privileged position when it comes to talking about his or her local literature, because we have the Icelandic sagas, which are the narrative, prose narratives written in Iceland in the 13th, 14th, and 15th centuries, and those works are obviously world literature, and they have had an incredible influence on a great variety of authors all over the world.
Borges springs to mind.
Borges, and you know, everything from Borges to Dashiell Hammett, for example, the American crime writer. You know, we could go on and on. W.H. Auden. I can sit here the whole night and just list authors who have been influenced by Icelandic literature. Goethe, you know, we can go on and on. And when you are born into a culture where you have a language that has been used for centuries as a literary language and has a treasure like the Icelandic sagas, it shows you that a geographic location or the size of a community isn't what makes major or minor literature. Great literature can come from any place, and you know, to compare ourselves again to Dante, we like to point out that the size of the population in Iceland when they were writing the Icelandic sagas was the same as the population of Florence, you know. And Florence, you know, we can see it as a small place now that created great literature and great art.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Well, the reason I thought I'd begin with this is because there's sometimes, speaking as a Maltese reader, there's sometimes here a sense of precariousness. And I like very much the way a Maltese critic once put it. He said, Maltese literature almost surprises itself by its very existence, with a sense that there's a precariousness in the existence of the language because it coexists with a quote-unquote big language, which is English, this being in some a complex bilingual situation. Whereas what I'm getting from you is that there's a very strong sense of confidence and a strong sense of the tradition in Icelandic literature. Is that something that writers who begin to write in Icelandic also feel, that they are sort of entering into this long tradition and therefore they are backed up by something that can make them strong and confident, so to speak?
Yes, I think when you have the sagas and also a Nobel Prize winner, Halldór Laxness, the novelist, was awarded the Nobel Prize in 1955, and he was born in Reykjavik in 1902, when Reykjavik was a town of 7,000 people, you know. So a Nobel Prize winner can be born in a town of 7,000 people. She can be born in a town of 700 people. She can be born on a farm of 7 people, you know. So we have the sense that we have an absolute license to write what we need and to take it out into the big world. And I think it's very good to remember that literature is not written by nations. Literature is not written by big populations. It's written by individuals who come from places. They come from places, and literature is a dialogue between places.
You know, you're reminding me of you have a wonderful couplet in one of your poems. I can't quote it verbatim, but it goes something like, when the flags of nations lose their colors, the earth will begin to flutter. It's, you've spoken about this before, haven't you? This idea that nations aren't so important. It's people and where they come from, and well, people who come from somewhere, but ultimately it's what they do.
Yes, there is a very beautiful sentence in one of Halldór Laxness' masterpieces, which is a book called "The Fish Can Sing" in English. At the end of the book, the main character, a young boy who's grown up as an orphan with an elderly couple, he's going out into the big world to become a singer, to sing for the world, because he's got the pure tone. And as they are taking him to the ship that will bring him out into the big world, his grandmother, as he calls her, the old lady that has brought him up, says to him, "Promise me one thing, that wherever you go and you meet an old wretched lady such as myself, bring her my greetings." And this is really what literature is about. It is bringing greetings from grandmothers to grandmothers, you know. I'm a great believer in grandmothers being the keepers and protectors of literature.
Our literary eaves.
Our literary eaves. And world literature is an archipelago of grandmothers sending greetings across the globe, you know. So literature comes from the smallest place, and it speaks to people in small places everywhere.
Well, I'm glad you walked so gracefully into the subject of world literature. It's something I'd like to address in relation to your work, but maybe now is a very good time for you to read an excerpt from your work. Do you think you could do that?
I can read a little bit. It's always easier to read standing up. I'll read the beginning of this book called "The Blue Fox" in English. And I chose this part because it is full of snow and winter, and I think that is something you might miss here in Malta, just as we sometimes miss the sun and the light in Iceland. We expect you to miss the opposite. I'll read the first page in Icelandic. Mórauðar tógur eru svo undurlíkar steinum að furðu sætir. Þegar þær liggja við þá á vetrum vonlaust að greina þær frá sjálfu grjótinu, já, mun snúnara en þessar hvítu sem alltaf skuggar í eða gulkar fyrir á hjarninu. Mórauð tóa liggur sem fastast við steinin sinn og lætur skafa yfir sig veðurmegin. Hún snýr rassinum í vindinn, hringar sig saman og stingur nefi undir lær. Lygnir aftur augum svo rétt matar í augasteinin. En þannig fylgist hún með manninum sem hefur ekki haggast frá þeirri stundu að hann lagðist undir hengjuna hér í efstu hlíðum Ásheima fyrir 18 tímum. Það hefur fokið yfir hann og snjóað, svo nú hann engu líkur nema tóftarbroti. Og dýrið verður að gæta þess að gleyma því ekki að hann veiðimaður. Blue foxes are so curiously like stones that it is a matter for wonder. When they lie beside them in winter, there is no hope of telling them apart from the rocks themselves. Indeed, they are far trickier than white foxes, which always cast a shadow or look yellow against the snow. A blue vixen lies tight against her stone, letting the snow drift over her on the windward side. She turns her rump to the weather, curls up, and pokes her snout under her thigh, lowering her eyelids till there is the merest hint of pupil. And so she keeps an eye on the man who has not shifted since he took cover under the overhanging drift here on the upper slopes of Ásheimar, some 18 hours ago. The snow has drifted and fallen over him until he resembles nothing so much as a hump of ruined wall. The creature must take care not to forget that the man is a hunter. He began his pursuit away south at Botn. The sky was clear and the first blush of day at its winter blackest. The man slid down over the home fields, then set a course north over the Ásar to Litlabjarg, where it had not drifted as yet. Once there, he caught a movement on the brow of the hill. Thrusting a hand inside his clothes, he took out a spyglass, extended it, and put it to his good eye. Yes, there was no mistaking it. There was a daughter of Reynard on the move. She seemed blithely unaware of any danger. All her movements indicated that she was on the prowl for a bite to eat. She went about her business unhurriedly, intent on this sole purpose. The man took a closer look at her. He bent his thought hard upon her, trying to get an inkling of what she intended, of which way she would go when she had finished her nosing on the crest. All of a sudden, she took off at a run. The man couldn't imagine why. Her whole demeanor showed that she sensed a grave threat. Yet, she couldn't have had the least suspicion of the man by ordinary means. She must have had a foreboding of his intention. He was a man with hunting on his mind. The man walked up a hill. He tried to keep the image of the vixen clear in his mind to help him find her again the more easily. She spins over the hard-packed snow like a top. Up on the crest, he cast around for the vixen's tracks. He pinched one fox print between thumb and forefinger. It seemed a sizable beast. In the snowflake that lingered on his fingertip lay a gleaming hair. There was no mistaking the color, blue. Vertical streaks of cloud in the west, maybe a storm on the way. The vixen nowhere to be seen. The trail was plain as far as the eye could see. The man walked briskly with the wind at his back. It didn't matter much now if the vixen caught his scent. She knew he was after her. He paused every now and then to cast around, using the same method as before. He bent all his thought on the one goal of working out which way the vixen would run and where he would get within striking distance. All at once, he receives word of which way she is going and where he will get within striking distance. The vixen is going north over the plain. She'll double sharply to the east with the gravel beds of Melar before her. Nothing but stones, a perfect hiding place for a blue fox. There was a whining in the air. A snowbird hurtled past, a hair's breadth from the man driven before the wind. It was followed by a falcon flying high with sure and steady wing beats. The man turned away from the blast, tightened his scarf, and wrapped the shoulder strap 3 times around his right arm, so the bag rested tight against his hip. He was not too late for the storm. Thank you.
So, the Blue Fox is a very curious narrative, I find. It reads a little bit like a fairy tale or a folk tale, and that's a characteristic that I also find in some of your other prose works. What is this fascination with the fable, the folk tale, the traditional form of the narrative? Where does it come from?
Well, I became known in Iceland in the 80s as a surrealist poet. A surrealist poet with punk tendencies. And at the time I was completely fascinated by the rebellious power of the surrealist image and the surrealist act, if you can say that. And I formed a group with some friends, a surrealist group called the Medusa. Our aim was to completely revolutionize and make Icelandic society surrealist. There were 7 of us. We came from the suburbs, self-publishing and full of belief in our possibilities as poets to change the world. Let's say Iceland at first. And I'm glad to say that we succeeded with Iceland. Iceland is completely surrealized now. It has been for a few years.
Today Iceland, tomorrow the world.
Yes, tomorrow the world. And Malta, here we are.
Malta is more surreal than you might imagine.
Oh, yes. Okay, that's good. So maybe I'll take some back with me to add to what we have there. No, but one of the things that I discovered when I was at my most surrealist in the early 80s was that there was a link between so many things I was reading about and experiencing in my research into surrealism, which connected with folk culture. One of the great contributions of surrealism to culture in the world is that it is almost non-academic. I would not say that it's anti-academic. It bypasses academia, and that's why it has been important in many cultures where you did not have high culture to support it, but you had a strong local culture, a strong heritage. And you can see this in the Caribbean, for example, and of course in Latin America. That and all over the world this happened. That surrealism was taken as an opportunity to renew or give new license to the use of a local folk heritage, because there are crazier things in the folk heritage than you will find in any surrealist poems. Yeah. So I discovered early on that there was a link, but I never found a way of building that bridge myself until I started working on the Blue Fox. Then I realized that by going into the Icelandic folk landscape, that by going there, I could actually use elements of my surrealist training, which had never been put to use before. And the book pretends to be a folk story, but it is written with the tools of surrealism and the modernist novel, really.
Yeah. There's also another, I guess, related aspect to your prose writing, which has to do with how you inject into your narratives not only elements of the folktale, but also elements of other literary works. I think the clearest example I can think of is The Whispering Muse, in which you quite literally inject elements of the Argonautica into the novel, right? And while I was reading that, I began to compare you a little bit to a computer hacker, and I'll tell you why. Because when a good programmer writes a virus, what they do is they write a little program and they embed it inside another one, and then there's some trigger thing that sort of makes it peep out, and suddenly you realize you've got a virus, but it's invisible otherwise. And it's there, and there are moments when it sort of pops out. And I find this a useful metaphor for the way your texts weave other texts into them. And you spoke about world literature earlier, and it seems to me that this is one way in which a work written now can also hark back and perhaps also laterally to other literary works and bring them in somehow. Do you feel that the process of writing prose or even poetry involves some constant back and forth, some constant dialogue with other literary works, wherever they may have been written?
Absolutely, and of what happens every time I start writing is that I realize that I have not only entered a dialogue with the Icelandic literary tradition and heritage, but world literature. And why is that? That is because Icelandic literature is obviously a part of a much longer tradition, and much of the medieval Icelandic literature was obviously based on the Germanic tradition, the wealth of stories that came from the Germanic world, but also from the world literature at that time. The people who wrote the Icelandic sagas in the medieval times were highly educated people who were bringing foreign influence into their writing. And one of the most loved and possibly one of the best sagas is the saga of Egill Skallagrímsson. Egill Skallagrímsson was a poet and Viking. And the book is full of amazing poetry using an incredibly elaborate system of metaphors, which Borges actually wrote about, the kennings, yes. And it has been suggested now that certain elements in the saga of Egill Skallagrímsson, elements that have to deal with his friendship with Arinbjörn, who is a character who returns to the story over and over again whenever Egill has made a mess of everything and is about to get killed by this king or the other because he's completely insulted them and vomited in the faces of their knights and whatever. It has been suggested now that the format, that the structure of this friendship tale within the saga of Egill Skallagrímsson comes from Disciplina Clericalis by Petrus Alfonsi, who was Al-Andalus Jew who moved to the north and became Christian, but wrote this amazing cycle of stories called Disciplina Clericalis. And in Disciplina Clericalis, you have the story of a whole friend and a half friend. And this story seems to be the model for the story of the friendship in the Icelandic saga. So this is an Icelandic tradition.
That's amazing.
Take whatever you find wonderful and well written and use it in your own story. That's what I'm doing. And Icelandic literature is a literature that has always been at its best when it embraces outside influence. So we have the sagas, which were influenced by, they were a multicultural project because in the country at the time, you had a population mostly made up of Norse people and Celtic people. So it was a multicultural project, you can say. And now, if it's right that Al-Andalus was also speaking through those writers, it's amazing. So in the 17th century, we had the Baroque, and we had the Romantic movement in the 19th century, and we had Surrealism in the 20th century. Icelandic literature is never good, except when it is sucking whatever it can out of other literatures and using it.
Well, this magpie-like tendency, which I really like. To me as a reader, the experience is always interesting because it's almost as if one is playing a little game, and you know, sometimes you think, oh, that must be the bit of code, that's the virus, you know, that's going to maybe I'll follow that and see if
I like to be called a virus.
Yeah.
In world literature.
I mean that in the best possible sense, of course. But there's another text which you constantly sort of write on or use and pull in, which is history. Some of your characters are based on historical figures, Jónas Pálmason, for example, in From the Mouth of the Whale, but also the historical backdrop in other novels like Moonstone, for example, which is important. You know, the Spanish flu outbreak, independence, and more distantly, the First World War. All happening in this autumn of 1918 in which Moonstone sort of happens. But in your view, what does fiction do to historical truth? Does it enhance it in some way?
It questions it. You know, you use the word truth. I don't believe in a historical truth. I think we can always revisit the past and look for the silences. Yeah. You know, there are so many silences in the official history. There are many silent moments. And what I did in Moonstone is that I went back to the moment of the birth of contemporary independent Iceland. Iceland became a sovereign country on the 1st of December 1918. So we are celebrating our 100th anniversary of sovereignty this year.
Congratulations.
Well, thank you. So what I did was that I went back to that autumn, the autumn of 1918, which was a very, it's one of those moments in history where everything happens at once. We were taking the steps towards the sovereignty. The Spanish influenza came to Reykjavik. The volcano Katla started erupting. It was there had been the coldest winter in history. The First World War was coming to an end.
So all the shit was hitting the fan, essentially.
Everything was happening at once, and this is, of course, you know, a moment of great tragedy because the Spanish influenza hit Reykjavik very hard. It's one of the darkest hours in the history of our little city. But, you know, it was also a moment of pride. And what I did was that I injected into that, yes, it's true, I like this idea of this you know, this metaphor of the virus, of using the virus as a metaphor of what I'm doing. Because I injected into that story, into the official story there, I injected a 16-year-old queer boy who is prostituting himself because he is a film fanatic. Yep. So that is the other element in the book. It is the fact that Icelanders became cinephiles very early on. So you have this 16-year-old kid who is dyslexic, an orphan, queer.
And a prostitute.
A drifter and a prostitute who takes us through Reykjavik and the historical events of the hour of sovereignty. So I like to go into those places and listen for the silences. And we have very few queer characters in Icelandic literature. And because there were no gay people in Iceland until 1978, when they formed an association to fight for the rights. So that's why the book is called The Boy Who Never Was. Yeah, so I like to go and revisit those historical grand narratives and see if somebody has been kept silent there and bring that person out, and then inevitably something happens because it means that this person is really rubbing against, what was right and wrong and proper and not.
In fact, in Moonstone, maybe the most moving moment was the moment of closure, the way that the novel closes and draws a line sort of directly from this boy who never was to somebody who was. And if you'll allow me, I'll just sort of read a little bit of that final part. It will be in memory of this man who will die of AIDS in the month of 1993, that Sigurdur Asgrimur's eldest son, Sigurjón, and I suspect that's you, will sit down to write the story of Mani Stein, the boy who never was. And you were talking here about the silences, and I asked you about history, but this is history with a small h, isn't it? This is the history of people, individuals, human beings, and also a memory of a future. You link a fictional past to a future that did indeed come about. In a personal way, I mean, you put yourself in this somehow. How much of your novel writing is also inspired by your personal history?
Well,
if at all?
I don't. It's never autobiographical, but obviously, I'm in there, and I have little cameos here and there in my books, as a way of like acknowledging that I'm there, I'm the genius Loki of the book, And in Moonstone, what I did at the very end is that I drew this line between the Spanish influenza and this kid who has been rejected by society but is moved to compassion and is helping out in the disaster. I drew a line between that story and the story of the young man who died of AIDS in the 80s and 90s in Iceland, and who were denied compassion by that society, And the book is dedicated to my uncle. So you can say that the moral rage that I felt by witnessing how the victims of AIDS and victims of the AIDS plague in the 80s and 90s, how they were treated in Iceland, because they were treated as if they were to blame for the disease and all that which happened in so many places. So the moral rage that I had kept within me for 20 years when I sat down to write the book, found an outlet there,
Yeah.
And I took a story from the past to talk about it. And that's why I believe in the fables, I do not write contemporary novels. Why do I not write contemporary novels? Because, if the reader feels that he or she is as much of an expert on the issues in the book as you are, the reader will start having an argument with you on the first page,
Which, by the way...
But most readers don't know anything about Reykjavik in 1918 or the Spanish influenza, so they just have to trust me, and we go and, I tell the story.
But you've got a reader, so to speak, who does that in Codex 1962, don't you? You've got a narrator who's got an interlocutor who's arguing with him all the time, and I really love that.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's too much sex here. Move on.
Yeah. So it's a demonstration
Yeah.
of what happens if you're not careful with being the one in charge of the story. And the Codex 1962 is really about the art of storytelling and the importance of stories and literature in this world, and that the only way we have of surviving is through telling each other our stories and the stories of what we and this world is made of. And I have to say, because I promised myself last year to mention it whenever I was given a microphone, and that is, I really think that literature, stories, the preservation of languages is going to be one of our most important tools in the decades to come because of climate change, you know, the effects of climate change. And when it comes to languages, we really have to be careful, because the first victims of climate change are small communities, are the indigenous people all over the world who live on the edge of the possible human habitat. These people, they might have within their languages the vocabulary we need when our places become the places of disaster. You know, they have lived under extreme circumstances for a millennia. They know how to speak to nature, you know, and to interact with nature through stories. And they have the lingo for it.
Yeah.
We don't have it in our cities and our safe industrial societies. So, yeah.
You've brought us full circle. We started talking about small languages, and here we are talking about how the languages of the small communities can teach us the language of the future. Perhaps on that note, we can bring this to a close. I don't know if you'd like to give us a very short reading to wrap this up.
No. Let's end on this note.
Let's end it on this note.
But let's end it on the note, because poetry is the main focus of this festival, you know. I would just like to say that I think the poem of all the literary forms, it is the poem that is most likely to save us, because the poem always exists on the edge of what is possible in language. So it is by pulling our weight behind the poem and the poet, who so often seems to be doing something just to please him or herself, you know, and to be playing with language. You know, this is the people that are going to keep language flexible enough for us to react and think in the disasters ahead.
So, with the hope of salvation, we'll leave it here. Ladies and gentlemen, it was a pleasure having Sjón on stage this evening. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you.